today's episode, I discuss about capitalism after the pandemic with Andrés Velasco in a conversation moderated by Antonio Roldán. Andrés is currently the Dean of the Public Policy School of the London School of Economics and has been previously Finance Minister of Chile and a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, NYU, and Columbia University. He has been a very successful academic, having been a leading scholar on financial crisis, liquidity crisis, exchange rate, international economics.
Thank you, Tony. Pleasure to be here. Delighted to be joining you and David and Luis to talk about these important and very difficult topics. You asked whether it will be big. I think it will be huge. At the risk of sounding like Donald Trump, it will be huge. Why so big? Because we've had financial crises, debt crises. If you come from a developing world, we've had exchange rate crises of all kinds, but we have never had a situation in which the government said to workers, please go home and don't work. And we've never had a situation in which the government said to business owners, please close the doors, send the workers home and don't produce anything. And that means that if you just do back of the envelope calculations, the impact on GDP, the impact on employment is going to be tremendous. The big elephant in the room, the big question which Luis and I can speculate on, but nobody can be sure, is how long this will last. If it's very short-lived, I think we have a chance of having a deep recession, but then a quick recovery. However, there are two things that stand in the way of that happy outcome. One is that we have to preserve what one might call employment relationships. You know, a firm is not just a bunch of machines and a bunch of employees. A firm is a bunch of people who've come together, who've been recruited, who've been selected, who've learned to work together. And a lot of the productive value of a firm is in that combination of human beings. If because of lack of cash, lack of liquidity, you're forced to send those people home, and then 6 months or a year from now, you say, well, guys, come back, we'll start production again. Many will be gone, many will have another job, many will have moved to a different city or a different country. So the lasting effect on productivity could be gigantic. That's issue one. The other issue, of course, is that if a firm has no cash, it may default on its workers. It may also default on its creditors. That means not paying your debts. And it is very easy to envision situations in which a productive and employment crisis morphs into a financial crisis. Rich countries, countries with powerful central banks, have many ways of avoiding that. And we've been seeing the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England doing things that would have sent most academics home with a heart attack just a few months ago, not simply buying government bonds, buying corporate bonds, buying junk corporate bonds. So I think there's a pretty good chance that in Europe and the UK and the US, a full-fledged financial crisis may be averted. The story, and I will say something about the emerging and developing world, the story is much harder and much tougher and potentially much more painful among middle-income countries, let alone low-income countries. First of all, because if you're a middle-class citizen in a middle-class country, you can go home for 2 months, not make any money, come back, get your paycheck in month 3 and live with it. If you're a guy who sells candy in the bus or on the sidewalk in Mumbai or in Sao Paulo or in Manila, chances are you don't have any savings, you don't have any other sources of income. So if you don't go out and work, you simply don't eat. Secondly, because lots of firms in developing countries are informal firms and lots of employment relationships are employment, government can't step in and say, I will pay your wage for 3 months because there's no contract, there's no pre-specified wage. Who is the government going to pay? At what rate is it going to pay? And in addition, lots of emerging countries are suffering from sort of not a double whammy, but a quadruple whammy. There's less demand for their exports from rich countries. The prices of commodities, beginning with oil, but not ending with oil, are in the basement. Some important sources of income, like remittances, say from the US or from Europe, to countries like Mexico or Guatemala or the Philippines, are plummeting. And last but not least, we've seen in the last couple of months the biggest capital outflows that we have ever seen. So if it's going to be big in the rich world, it is going to be bigger probably in the developing world. And here, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, I'll say one sentence about it. Here is where the world community, the international financial community, could make a big difference, providing financing. My reading of what went on last weekend in the virtual IMF World Bank meeting is that lots of nice, sweet, well-meaning things were said, but no tough decisions or few tough decisions were made. And as a result, the financing that is available for many developing countries is very little, or at least not enough to meet this gigantic need. And I think a lot of human suffering will occur as a result. Let me stop there.
Okay, Andrés, fantastic. Luis, give us your views, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So first of all, thanks for the Friedrich Neumann Stiftung, and thanks to Sadet for having us here. It's really a pleasure, and it's really great to share a stage with Andrés. I agree fully with everything Andrés has said. I want to add a little bit of a temporal dimension to what he said. There are two uncertainties on the medical side that are still really, really far from being resolved. And they seem so basic that it's pretty shocking with so many smart scientists the world over working hard at this, that we don't still have them. The first one is, how many immune people are there out? How many people actually caught the virus? Today, the Swedes said they think in Stockholm by the 1st of May will have been 600,000. I mean, that is shocking, right? Because there's been very few people dead in Sweden. If there is so many people who have the illness and so few people dead, first of all, the mortality is much lower than we think. And second, we're closer to immunity than we think. There have been two studies in California today, one in Santa Clara, one other one also in California, I think in LA, that also have found relatively high rates of people who had the illness and presumably have antibodies and presumably have immunity. So this is huge uncertainty we can't know. The second is why how many people are immune, but how long does the immunity last? That's really a key question, because if the immunity lasts for 2-3 years, then we're going to have a wave now, and then eventually be immunized for a while, although it's not so long. But if the immunity lasts for months, or maybe the carriers are not immune, like in HIV, then are actually, maybe the immune people, the people who have been affected are still carrying, then we're in trouble. So that's the first issue. If this wave is going to give way to what Tony called today in the newspaper or yesterday, not just to a single peak, but a wave of peaks. And the second is the vaccine. Are we going to have a vaccine, and when are we going to have? So those are two issues that are going to tell us how long this is going to last. In the worst scenario, where few people are immune and where the immunity doesn't last very long, and we are going back to this kind of situation more times, then the scenario is indeed, as Andrés said, catastrophic. In the best scenario, where the illness is now going down because many more people than we think have actually had it, then we could actually see a relatively quick turnaround. So those two variables, immunological variables, that are really in their infancy yet of being known, are crucial. The second thing that I would also add in a time dimension is this policy that Andrés was describing by the Fed, the Bank of England, the ECB, and the governments of we'll do whatever it takes. We'll just plug as much money, put as much money in the economy as necessary and more. How long can this policy last? I mean, and I would like to hear Andrés, because this is something Latin America has a lot of experience in. It's a bit of an Argentina policy. We are printing money and not producing goods. I mean, the usual economics view of this is that this ends up, after 2, 3, 4, 5 months of doing this thing, it ends up in hyperinflation. Of course, now demand is so suppressed, everybody's home. So the main concern economists have is deflation. Prices go down because nobody's spending. But as you continue doing this basic money printing, as you continue injecting so much money into the economy without goods to produce, and we move into the fall, if this crisis lasts for sufficiently long, then the big fear from an economic perspective has to be that at some point you lose the anchor of expectations, that people start thinking that this money doesn't mean anything, and that we lose control of the whole monetary system. So I would agree with Andrés that the situation is dire economically. I would add these two uncertainties on the immunology side, and a question that if the crisis lasts for very long, a question about how long can this monetary stimulus and the whole stimulus packages we're putting in the US already $2 trillion. The ECB is right now buying assets at a rate of 38 billion a week. Those are big numbers, and how long can we last doing that?
I don't know, Andrés, if you want to come in
just a thought. Unlike Luis, I never spent any academic days at the University of Chicago, so I'm a little bit less worried about inflation than he is. The two guys who get it right, in my view, and you can see their piece in Vox EU, are Jean Pisani and Olivier Blanchard, who wrote a very nice piece in which they make a point which I think is valid. Money and bonds issued by the government are very different beasts when the interest rate is positive and high. When the interest rate is zero for all practical purposes, whether the UK government issues something called a pound or whether it issues something called a UK government bond, they're both government liabilities. They both carry an interest rate of zero. And what we know is that debt is not inflationary. Money in these circumstances is probably not inflationary either. In fact, 10 years ago, in the middle of the crisis, the Federal Reserve increased its balance sheet by a factor of 4, not 4%, 4 times. And the inflation rate in the US hovered around 0. And in fact, it was negative for short periods of time, as it was in the eurozone. Now, can you do that again and still remain at very low levels of inflation? I think the answer in the short run is yes. The big question, and Olivier and Jean make this point clearly in their piece, is at some point, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, the interest rate will have to rise. At that point, bonds or money are not equivalents. People may want to hold onto the bonds and dump the money. And the big question is, what will the government do or the central bank do at that point? One thing they can do is pay interest and reserves, which is what the Fed did, what the Bank of England did, not the ECB. That's fiscally expensive, but it's perfectly feasible. And that is a pretty strong way of preventing inflation in the future. So I would not lose much over inflation.
So Andrés, let me ask you directly on that. It's nice to disagree. So I am also not losing any sleep over inflation over the next very short time. But you must agree that, just let's put the case extreme. Everybody's staying home month after month. All the checks in the economy, all the wages are coming from the Fed. Just put in the US, basically from the Treasury, but basically directly financed from the Fed. And we're not producing anything. At some point, you have to agree that this is not sustainable. I mean, do you think there's really no limit over the November, December, January, February scenarios?
No, I think I will be first to admit that I have some sense we can guess what the world looks like if this goes on for 3 or 4 months. If it goes on for 6 or 7, I have no idea. And I worry then not only about the economics, I worry about our people's sanity, people's health, those of us who have teenagers in the house, whether civil war will break out inside every family, many things could go wrong. But one economics thought, what you're saying is the government is pumping up demand, there's no supply. So what happens to the demand-supply balance? That is a valid question, but it is also important to remember that while we're home, we're consuming a lot less than we would have been otherwise. I had tickets to go to Italy and got them canceled. I had tickets to the theater, had to cancel them. I was going out to restaurants with my wife. I'm no longer doing that. So consumption is down. Savings is going up. And of course, our savings is exactly what the government is tapping to be able to, buy those bonds. So there is a kind of equilibrium there. How long it will last is anybody's guess.
Okay, I am happy to agree with that. There is no question the deflationary shock is there. There's no question we're all spending way less than we used to, and that's clearly the first order effect right now is like there is really no demand and no and deflation is clearly the biggest short run problem. I would not disagree with that.
To ask, I think it's really interesting what you're saying. If you can probably freeze the economy for a few weeks, you cannot freeze it forever, and that's an issue that we need to think about. At some point, you need to probably let some companies fall. You'll have to make very hard decisions from governments, and that's something. I mean, the consensus among doctors is that we'll get this virus coming back, right? And this is really problematic in the medium term. So why don't you give me your ideas about how? So basically, and we are here organizing this with the Liberal Party. For the last 60, 70 years, since the Second World War, the large amounts of progress we have achieved in many ways are related to the globalization and to the free movement of people and goods. And this is definitely affecting in many ways the way probably goods are going to be traded, the way people are going to move. What are your views on this? Is that change going to be structural? What do you think? How is this going to affect globalization?
Luis, why don't you shoot first? I'll follow.
Is it now? Am I now being heard? So yes, thank you. I will do that. So my sense is that we are going to have to adapt to a new normal. I don't think and again, we have to rely very strongly on the doctors on this issue. And most people looking at how the cold virus has been evolving over the years don't think we'll get permanent immunity. We'll have a very nasty, very efficient virus that is pretty good at jumping from person to person and is pretty bad in terms of hospital outcomes that we will have to land with at least for the next year, a year and a half. What that means is that everything to how we travel in planes, to how we travel in trains, to how we stand in beaches or in our holidays, our restaurants, etc., is going to have to change, and that affects crucially a lot of what globalization has achieved. I don't think over the next few months and over the foreseeable future, we're going to just be able to jump on a plane and go to another country for the weekend, etc. I think that particularly when you think of what Andrés was mentioning about the impact on the third world, if some countries, let's say the Schengen area, manages to contain this, and then it's really endemic in places, for example, like Africa or like Latin America, you can envision clearly how borders will be closed and people will be told they cannot come from certain places. So I would think that's going to be a first impact in terms of movement of people, but I think there's also a big impact in terms of movement of goods, because I think the idea of industrial policy, which was kind of abandoned, it's like old-fashioned, there's just every country specializes in whatever they should, etc., suddenly is back. Now we need industrial policy if we have to be worried about essential supplies getting cut off from us. Do we have to worry about medical supplies? Do we have to worry about electronics? Do we have to worry about certain other things? And that means that I think places like the United States and the European Union are going to have to think strategically about what are the goods that we worry about their supply and what are the goods that we actually think we should have a whole supply chain at home. So I would think that it's very likely that both in the movement of people and the movement of goods, we will see substantive changes as a result of this.
Andrés?
I think, and this is certainly not a comment about what Luis said, but it is a comment about what many other people are saying. There is a risk in this crisis that we engage in confirmation bias, meaning enemies of globalization are saying, yes, of course, this is the end of globalization. People worried about inequality are saying the crisis will deepen inequality. People who worry about XYZ are saying, yeah, I told you, XYZ were going to be an issue. I would be a little bit more careful. I agree with Luis that there are two dimensions in which we will see changes. Clearly, in the mobility of people, we were seeing changes, at least in Europe, long before this crisis, and some of that will continue. Parenthetically, I will note, just as a footnote, that the flows of people that cause much concern and political crises in Europe are tiny by the kind, compared to the flows of people we're seeing in other parts of the world. 5 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela. Colombia has 1.5 million Venezuelans. Chile has 500,000. Brazil has 500,000. You don't see people on the street having anti-Venezuelan marches. So what constitutes a nation's tolerance for immigration clearly varies a great deal. And I think we Latin Americans are finding that we're surprisingly tolerant, more so than other nations in other latitudes. I think it is also true that partially because of COVID and partially because of environmental concerns, we will have more meetings on Zoom. We will have fewer meetings after flying for 18 hours to sit in a room with partners for 3 hours. I am finding having lots of meetings on Zoom is very pleasant. I can take a walk and talk to my children between meeting and meeting. It's not really that bad. But I don't think, going from those two examples to a more general proposition, I don't think this is the death knell of trade, of the movement of services, and certainly not of all the other things that globalization entails. I suspect that people in Britain may be very fond of British cheese, but they will continue to covet French and Italian and Spanish cheese, and they will continue to buy that. And where essential or strategic supplies are concerned, yes, I think we may see a bit more government intervention. But I think the firms themselves will begin to look at making supply chains more secure. I was talking to an official in the Mexican government recently, and he said, this is a great opportunity for Mexico. Mexico's next door to the US. Many big American firms have moved production of components to China or to Vietnam or to Indonesia. That's a world away. Not all production that used to be in China will come to Mexico, but maybe American firms will say, I'll manufacture 20% in Mexico just to make sure that I have it nearby in case of an emergency, whether it be a virus or an earthquake or a national security emergency or what have you. So more than a zero-sum game in which, more than a 0-1 black and white situation in which is all globalization, no globalization. I think you may have a reshuffling of globalizations in which there are some winners and there are some losers, but I'm pretty sure we will continue to trade. Now, one thought about the politics of all, I imagine we're going to talk about politics in a minute. Whatever happens to the real trade, something that is very important is what is the narrative that emerges from this. Because even if trade continues to happen, last time around, the narrative that became dominant after the crisis is, Wall Street got a bailout, Main Street got very little. And so we have to worry about what is said and how this is all processed. And I think a lot remains to be said, or at least a lot remains to be understood in that dimension.
If I can add, Tony, if you allow me to add something. So I was trying to talk in the world of what is what I expect to be not the positive world, not the normative world of what I would actually want to see. I think trade, I agree with Andrés that trade will remain as important as ever, that we actually want a lot of trade. I mean, we don't want suddenly all these countries in the third world, in the developing countries that have come out of poverty by having the possibility of trading with the West, to suddenly be locked out of these markets and to really fall back into poverty. So we have to make an effort, I think, the friends of markets and of the prosperity of humanity, to push back against the forces that will try to use this to close borders. I think that this statement of what should happen doesn't stop me from thinking that a lot of what will happen in movement of goods and people will be backwards.
So yeah, continuing with what you say, I find really relevant the debate as regards to what's going to happen with populism and nationalism, which is very related to what you were saying, right? Just before this crisis, both of you wrote wonderful books on what's going to happen to the future of liberal democracy, the challenge of populism, etc. Here there are different views, right? So we see on the one hand some people that think that perhaps this is going to be good to fight populism, because then we will have more support for democratic and for people that are actually serious in managing public policy. But some others think, look, now we're going to get back to nationalism and the scapegoat of whatever virus that comes from China, etc., is going to be there again. So, what are your views on that? Are we going to go towards increasing nationalism and populism, or go towards less of that, Andrés?
Great question. Let me tell you which view I think is wrong, and then I will try to guess what view may be right. There was a popular view a few weeks ago that went like this. Populist leaders, think of Trump in the US, think of Bolsonaro in Brazil, think of López Obrador in Mexico, maybe to some extent Boris Johnson in the UK, although he's certainly not in the league of the other three. Maybe these guys are bungling the crisis. Clearly, in the case of Trump, his management has been incompetent, out of touch, lots of other things. So the view was these guys are going to do so badly and Democrats are going to do much better. As a result, liberal Democrats will look good and the populists will look bad. I don't think that's necessarily the case, among other things, because lots of other authoritarian regimes, maybe not populistic, but clearly non-democratic, are doing quite well. Think of China, think of Singapore. And needless to say, there are plenty of Western democracies which are not governed by populists, where nonetheless the management of the crisis has not been so great. I can think of several Western European countries that fall under that category. So my first point is we should not simply sit, have a drink and expect that because they are bungling incompetence, the populists will be booted out. That would be way too optimistic, way too complacent. Now, I think what will really make a difference is whether coming out of this crisis, the populations feel that it was hard, we suffered, but we were all in it together, as opposed to, once again, some people got a privilege, some people got an easy ride, others did not. I'm speaking from West London right now, and I've been talking to lots of my English friends about London today compared to London in 1940. The city was locked down back then, the city is locked down today. And what many English historians say, I'm reading a great book about London during the war, is that the sense of national unity and national purpose that has been very clear in the UK for the last 40 years, even during some pretty bad economic times in the 60s and 70s, came from the fact that the war was terrible, but the British stood shoulder to shoulder, and they defeated the fascists, they defeated the Nazis, and the rich guy from Oxford and the poor kid from a mining town, both were in the same trench fighting the same enemy. If Western countries can come out of this crisis in the spirit in which people, applaud the NHS every Thursday night in London, or in the spirit in which people in Barcelona or Madrid applaud health workers, or in New York, they do exactly the same thing, and people clap to show respect for first responders. In that sense, I think the institutions of liberal democratic government will have been strengthened. They will be viewed as they work for us. They don't necessarily just work for them. But I can also imagine an outcome which is not 1945. It looks more like 2010, in which people say there are these academics and these lawyers and these professionals who are sitting in their comfortable apartments, and they keep working from home and they keep getting paychecks. And I work in a pizza parlor, and the pizza parlor is closed, and I can't do my job, and I'm not getting paid. So society again fragments into many identities, and some identities feel disrespected and mistreated by other people. In which case, almost regardless of public policy, the institution of government and the institution of liberal democracy will come out a little shaken. Which one of the two will it be? I think, as they say in the United States, the jury's still out, but we will know pretty soon.
Luis, I know you have more ideas on this if you want to develop them.
Yes, I am happy to address this. So there is something strange. It's probably coincidence. I don't want to do a very small n analysis, but in the fact that the US, the UK, Spain, and Italy, which are the countries that, to me, from the outside, seem to be basically bungling the, or at least appear to be less effective, let me put it like this, are the countries that have seen populism and polarization corrode their administration most. In the US, we see a president who is basically doing politics with everything. All the discussion is partisan. The governors, the decisions to leave or not to leave the house, the decision to do quarantine or not, every single decision is political. In the UK, we see a civil service that was very weakened, and a government that was very weakened by the Brexit debate, and a very big growth of populism. In Spain, we've seen government deteriorating over the last years, and we've seen that in Italy with a very big growth of populism and a very also kind of loss of inefficiency of the state. This crisis is very much about state capabilities. The state, or appears to be very much about state capabilities. The state that work, the Germanys of the world, etc., seem to implement testing. They do hundreds of thousands. I think Germany is doing 600,000 tests a week. They do lots of tests. They seem to control, to act early. They seem to figure out what's going on. They seem to have good information. And countries like the four I mentioned that have seen biggest weakening by populism seem to be less effective. Now, the way I would like the reaction of public opinion to be would be towards efficient government, not towards big government or small government, but we need good government. We need administration that is well paid, good civil service, politicians that are well prepared. We need a very a political class that is able to come together and not look for silly reasons to polarize. I always kind of have to think of the Tuesday last week, the 14th or Wednesday, whenever it was, the 14th of April was the anniversary of the Second Republic. In a moment where we need people to come together, where we need to be sending message of unity, of we're going to beat this together, a vice prime minister of this country spends the whole day tweeting against the head of state and the fact that he wore a military uniform, etc. That's divisive, that weakens the response, that loses cohesion, and that's exactly what we don't need. So my sense is that there is a much better response. I mean, it's really early days to say it, okay? And I realize I don't have a big regression to say, but I think there's a better response from the countries that have more cohesive governments, more professional administrations, less weakened by populism. And I hope that the response by people is we need governments like that.
I like that optimism.
Let me add one thing. I think this is absolutely right. It is not a coincidence that countries, now there are two viruses at work here. One is called COVID-19. The other virus is called populism and demagoguery. They're both contagious and they're both nasty. And Luis is absolutely right. Countries in which the virus of demagoguery has been present and strong are countries that are bungling the response. No question about that. I guess my doubt is that bungling the response is one thing, getting punished politically for bungling the response is another thing, because at a time of hugely polarized politics, at a time in which Americans choose the radio station or the television station or the website they visit mostly because it confirms their own biases, you know, Trump is going to run a political campaign in the autumn in which he will blame the virus on the Chinese. And there will be people who say, of course, it's the fault of the Chinese. So in the time of the two viruses, of the twin viruses, populism can twist politics and can twist truth in very dangerous ways. So whether the inept governments will get punished at the polls for being inept is what I'm not entirely sure about. I wish it were the case. I wish I could say yes, but we've seen so many nasty things happen at the polls in recent years that I've learned to be a little bit skeptical.
Very, very interesting. I would like to ask you a million questions, but let me, to follow what you were saying, Andrés, in relation to how the crisis will hit probably differently different sectors. So there are a number of potential rising inequalities, right? So there are divisions between temporary workers and permanent workers. There are regional divisions between urban and rural, even gender divisions in how the crisis is affecting people. Also intergenerational divisions. So we see the elderly who are sadly more affected by the virus, but in a way also more protected socially. The young people that were already in a terrible situation before that, right? So how do you think the inequality story will affect politics, and how do you think we can change that, or we can influence to minimize in the best possible way the inequalities that are rising?
Luis, you want to jump first?
No, I'll go second this time.
Okay, happy to. I worry about three kinds of inequality, and of course the list is long. In many countries of the West, in Europe, North America, there's been the growing perception that the world is divided between the citizens of everywhere and the citizens of somewhere. The citizens of everywhere are people who do virtual webinars like this one in the language of the world, which is English, who can work from home, whose incomes are fairly well protected across the economic cycle and fairly well protected from pandemics. And the citizens of somewhere are the people who work at the pizza parlor or at the factory or at the local beauty parlor, and who today can't work. They have a little bit of insurance from the government, but that insurance may not be enough or may not last. And if that perception of society split between white collar and blue collar, between cosmopolitan citizens and citizens of small towns and faraway places, that division is likely to be deepened by this crisis. Whether the pocketbook will actually show those numbers to be what I'm suggesting is important, but it is not of the essence. But the perception, I think, will be that some groups got a lucky break, some groups didn't. Secondly, you point out, Tony, something that is politically incorrect to mention, but which happens to be very true. In most countries, senior citizens vote more than the young. As a result, governments spend more per capita, a great deal more on pensions than on daycare or education. And one could argue that young people are the big victims of this situation, because young people have very low risk of death from contagion, and therefore they could be out working, and they're being kept from work because of the lockdown, which is uniform across all ages. And again, in countries with weak pension systems, in countries in which people may be asked to pay more taxes in the future to finance pensions which are probably unsustainable, that will be a nasty issue. Again, not a new one, but a nasty issue indeed. Last but not least, let me spend a minute on the divisions between the advanced countries and the emerging countries. Emerging countries today account for 50% of world GDP. So it is in the interest of rich countries that emerging countries do well on at least two sets of grounds. First of all, contagion. After all, the virus came from China. And if the virus remains alive in many other nations outside North America and Western Europe, it will come back for a second, third, or fourth wave. But in addition to that, most firms in Europe and the US today need the market that is China or India or Brazil or Mexico or Turkey or Poland or South Africa. There will be no fashion industry in Europe without China within the Middle East, to give you one example. And as a result, if the emerging markets tank in years to come, everybody, emerging market citizens first, but rich country citizens as well, are going to pay a price. What's the difference in the world rates of growth between now and the previous crisis? 10 years ago, even in the worst year, that was 2008, I think, the world kept growing ever so slightly because Europe and the US and Japan came down very sharply, but China, India, Poland, Turkey kept on growing. And as a result, the world rate of growth was positive, very slightly, but positive. If you believe the IMF, this year, the world rate of growth is going to be -3. And that's partially because the rich countries are going to tank, but also because China is posing the first negative growth ever. And the virus really has not hit most countries in Asia, most countries in Africa yet. So you could have a situation in which, because of structural reasons, because of low incomes, because of weaker states, as Luis was saying, truly a devastating situation, both in emerging markets and especially in low-income countries. In Latin America, I can think of serious problems in Peru or Mexico or Brazil or Chile, but these are upper middle-income countries. Once you go to low-income countries, think about Central America, think about Haiti, think about the rest of the Caribbean, think about Bolivia, the combination of lost export revenues, capital outflows, very weak states, very limited medical capacity. We're talking about potential deaths in the millions. And as a result, when you talk about inequality, when you talk about lasting scars and nasty political repercussions, that's one element we simply cannot forget.
Very interesting.
I will what I'll do is I was just hearing Andrés and I will use basically his same division on 3 categories and just kind of use it in different ways, but just to keep the analysis similar. I agree on the income. There is the biggest gap in this crisis is between those who can work at home and those who can't. I bet the 3 of us have had a more productive month in the last month than probably any other month in the last few years. I've not had wasted meetings, trips that I have to do a lot with being MEP. I have to go back to Brussels and Strasbourg and Madrid and all the time. I haven't wasted time in meetings. I have basically been working 7 days a week, morning to night, very well. I haven't lost a minute of activity. So the difference between those who can work at home and those who can't is a difference that is going to affect information workers that were already helped by the information revolution versus the rest. So that's something that goes in the same direction as past changes. But there is one thing that I think is important that is very different. In the past, let's say in the 1990s, when you would ask any of us, what do you think the internet will do? And we think it will go against big cities and in favor of rural areas because people will want to move and live in a beautiful place in the middle of nowhere rather than be in a city. That didn't happen. The internet helped cities because people wanted to bump on each other and creative types want to be together with other creative types. Now, this one is different, in my opinion. I think that the attractiveness of a city, when you cannot go to a restaurant, to a bar, to a museum, to the concert, for a walk, blah, blah, versus living in a little town or in a village where you can just walk around the mountains, if you can get internet and you want to work at home, I think rural versus urban is maybe one vector of inequality that is going to go in a different direction in the past. Rural is going to actually benefit potentially. Agriculture also, but also a primary sector, but also just simply living out of the big towns. On demographics, I wanted to add something. I agree totally with what Andrés said about young versus old. I want to add a thought simply on the people who are between 30 and 40 today. Those are people who came out of university in the crisis or of high school in the crisis, who had a few very, very hard years, who have seen situation just improving from, let's say, 2015, 16, who've started to get more steady jobs. Remember, in Spain, we had 14% unemployment still. And this same generation now is 38, 36, 40 and is getting hit by a second blow. I think that that is a generation that is going to suffer most. They haven't been able to accumulate assets. And when we do policy, we have to think of that generation. And third, geographically, I don't want to make a distinction north-south that was so well done by Andrés, but I want to make a distinction north-south inside the European Union. By a mix of bad luck and bad government, the worst countries hit in the European Union have been the ones with higher debt and most hit by the 2008 crisis, Spain and Italy. The geographic tensions inside the European Union are going to be very, very big and are going to have potentially very difficult consequences for Europe. I'll leave it at that because it's time and I can't spend too much more.
No, I think we still have time for one or two more questions. We've been about 50 minutes. And I'm going to try to collect a couple of ideas of all the people that are following us from through LinkedIn and YouTube. One relevant question and connected to what you were saying, Luis, and I would like to hear both of you talking about this. One of the big challenges, Luis has been extremely connected to this, obviously, as an MEP, is what's going to happen with the euro. As you were saying, the pile of debt in the south is going to be perhaps more problematic than the pile of debt in the north. We already had a lot of debt, and if interest rates go up, we will probably end up in a very complicated situation for some countries in the south and also for the eurozone. There are many things moving on. It's incredible. I think many of us are surprised about how good the EU is reacting in some ways. The ECB has been ambitious, the Commission as well. Luis, why don't you give us your views, and Andrés probably on that also from the standing of, obviously, of financial markets, etc. If you want to give us your view also on the eurozone and the future of Europe, and probably we close it there.
Thank you, Tony. I would say the eurozone is very vulnerable. It has never been so vulnerable. The key point of vulnerability is obviously Italy. I had a chat with Luigi Zingalis 2 weeks ago on a podcast like this, which people can find online, in which Luigi said something that really shocked me. He said the difference between Italy and Greece, I'm paraphrasing, Greece didn't have any outside options, Italy does. And his view was, I don't know if this is true, I think this is, his view was if Italy doesn't see sufficient support from the European Union, it has an outside option. And the outside option is China. He said, at this moment in time, you ask people to stay at home, so there's no bank panics. People just stay because you're doing some extra care. You can have a huge loan from China. You can shift the geopolitical orientation of Italy from Europe to China in a fortnight. If you are a populist government, Salvini, somebody like that. Mm-hmm. And we know how crazy some of the people working in the Lega are. So the risk to Europe right now is really existential. I agree with you that there have been many steps that have been given already. All the 3 layers of insurance agreed by Eurogroup for workers with the SURE, for firms with the European Investment Bank, and for states with the ESM, plus the money from the ECB, are going to ensure that we can continue viable. People can borrow and people can continue being liquid for the short term. If this crisis lasts, if this help is not enough, if there is a huge debt overhang that makes it very hard for Italy to grow, I think everything is possible. I really hope that tomorrow there's a council, by a European Council and heads of state, etc., and government. I hope that Europe continues in this good path that has started a couple of weeks ago.
Andrés, if you want to give us your concluding remark.
Yeah. I mean, just on the eurozone, I've never been a big fan of the euro. Luis knows this. I've been writing about exchanges all my life, and I've always had a hard time thinking of Europe's exchange arrangements as making a great deal of sense. But there they are. We're not going to get rid of them. But I think in retrospect, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, the eurozone came about, this close to being undone. I was in Athens several times during the crisis, so I know exactly, and talking to policymakers there, I know exactly how close Athens came. And of course, the Greeks didn't do it for the reason that Luis just mentioned. You know, they had no place to go. Now, whether China is or not an alternative, it could be. I guess all I can add to this is, in my part of the world, a few countries have gone to China for emergency loans. They have found China to be, how shall we put it, a fairly demanding taskmaster when you are indebted to China. And parenthetically, a fascinating issue that is going to crop up now is, in the World Bank IMF meeting last week, one of the agreements was to seek relief, debt relief for lots of countries. Well, it used to be that when it came to official debt, it was all, you know, the UK, the US, the Scandinavians, you know, the European Union. It turns out that one of the biggest creditors today is China. But China, of course, is not a member of the Paris Club. So I think it's going to be fascinating, and maybe the Italians will be looking to learn from this. You know, whether when you get into trouble, China says, oh, bygones are bygones, I'm willing to forgive half of your debt, or whether China says, no way, maybe the Europeans and the Americans will forget about your debt, but we Chinese will not. Nobody has any clue. China has made no sounds on this, but China will be under a great deal of pressure to engage in debt forgiveness vis-a-vis Africa, South Asia, Central America, the Caribbean, etc. So maybe the Italians will have good news. Maybe the Italians will have bad news. Who knows? I suspect the news will be pretty bad on that front.
Thanks so much, Luis. Andrés, it's been fascinating to hear you both. I think Luis needs to leave already for another meeting. Thank you, everyone, for following us. Thanks, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, for bringing about this initiative. And thanks to all. I hope I'll see you very soon.
Very good.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Andrés. Thank you, Tony. It was really a great chat.
My real pleasure and honor. Let's do it again.
Thank you.